Afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with our K-State Garden Hour series as we have a lot of stuff to get to today. I want to thank you for joining us. This series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. And today, my name is Kelsey Haddisall, and I am going to be the host for today's Zoom. I am an extension agent in River Valley District. This webinar series has given us able to have us still provide you extension related horticulture and gardening programming throughout this crazy time that we're living in. So everyone involved in this development of this series has been an extension professional for K-State, and most of us have backgrounds in horticulture education and are extension agents at the local level. But most of us just have a love for gardening and the natural environment. So each week we have featured a new topic related to gardening and horticulture, and our goal is to meet the needs of new gardeners as well as seasoned gardeners. So today we have a moderator. Her name is Cassie Homan, and she is the horticulture agent for the Post Rock District. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please send them over through the Q&A or the chat section down at the bottom of your screen. There is an ability to send privately to our moderator if you would like, but you can put it in the Q&A section as well. Cassie will be keeping track of those questions that come in, and we will have a question and answer period at the end of our speaker's presentation. We will do our best to get through all of those questions, but in the event that we do not have time, there will be additional resources on our Horticulture and Natural Resources website. This is a great reference for you after the presentation, as we have all the webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on that website at a later date. We also have the previous series that we have done, webinars we have done are listed on the website as well. We also have links to it on our H&R Facebook page, and you can stay up to date with what's going on in our department like that. So let's get to why we all came here today. We came to learn about nuisance wildlife control in your garden. We have Charlie Lee with us today, and he is a extension specialist through the Kansas State University, and he is our wildlife expert and knows everything about wildlife, and we send him all of our crazy questions from snakes to prairie dogs and everything in between. So Charlie, if you'd like to take over and share your screen, we'll get started.
All right, good afternoon. Today I'd like to take a little bit of time and explain to you a few things that I've learned in my career about managing wildlife, and perhaps provide you some information that will be useful in you solving some of the problems in your particular garden. Wildlife is enjoyable. There's over 100 million people in the United States that participate in watching wildlife. Unfortunately, at times, wildlife can be damaging. They can be a nuisance, can be considered a threat to human health and safety. But the question becomes, how do you know when that time is? Seem to be having a little bit of difficulty in that I'm not able to advance my slides. Is anybody else? Did they stop?
You may have to click on the slideshow, Charlie.
Okay, we'll just do it by clicking. Not all wildlife are pests. At times they can be irritating or annoying, but it's when they become damaging, destructive, and create an unusual and an unacceptable amount of damage that I consider them nuisance wildlife. Each particular situation is somewhat different, and it's an individual decision of when that wildlife is causing damage and being considered a pest or a nuisance. As we get started, keep in mind that there are 4 principles of wildlife damage management, regardless of which species or type of problem you're having. The first one is perhaps the most important one, and that's that you recognize the wildlife damage patterns so you know which species is responsible for doing the damage. Oftentimes the damage occurs at night and you're not able to see the species responsible. So you have to be part detective and interpret the evidence that's left at the scene, whether it's the plant that's been chewed off, a hole, a burrow, teeth marks, so that you know what species is responsible. Then you need to understand a little bit of the biology of that particular species, so you can use some of those biological traits to reduce the damage that is occurring. And third is to know what the management alternatives are. There's usually a lot of management alternatives, and each one has a different impact. And there's really not a cookbook response where I can say, this is the best alternative, this is second, this is third. Typically, I can give you my recommendations of what I would try first, but there's always other options. And then make sure with whatever management technique you're going to utilize that it's following local, state, and federal laws. Local homeowner associations, cities have many rules and regulations that may restrict some of the tools that you're able to use. The state laws and federal laws probably are not going to apply too much in your garden environment. And I'm very familiar with the state and federal laws and can explain those if necessary. When pests, wildlife pests cause damage, which may be damage to food or crops or buildings or vehicles, turf, livestock, we think of all of those management alternatives, but you can condense those alternatives down to this acronym, HER. The H stands for habitat modification. Is there some way to remove those things that the wildlife are finding valuable in your particular environment? Can you remove the food, eliminate the cover, or reduce or eliminate the water? So first we want to think habitat modification. If that does not yield effective results, then go to E, exclusion. Exclusion is the use of chemical repellents, fences, or psychological barriers of some sort. Those could be acoustic, they could be visual decoys perhaps of a predator. It can be chemicals, it can be a physical barrier like a chain link fence or wire mesh, or it can be more of a psychological barrier like an electric fence. And then finally, R is for removal. When the first two are not successful, if they are not successful, then you have the option of removing that individual animal or the whole group of animals in that particular area, relocating those animals, or euthanizing those animals. So most all wildlife problems can be resolved with this acronym. It's just different slight modifications to each one of these categories. Well, where do you go to get resources to tell you about this biological traits and information? This is my website, wildlife.ksu.edu. Pretty easy to remember. The publications I've authored are there in the center column. Those are the most recent ones. The information up in the left-hand column specifically talks about wildlife species, wildlife habitats, some other information that some folks might find useful. I also do a weekly radio program, and I've done that radio program since 1990. Probably at least a third of those programs deal with some aspect of wildlife that may be causing problems. So there's a tremendous amount of information on this site. as well as links to what I call other trusted resources that are out there. Unfortunately, there's a lot of information on the internet. It's not all science-based. In fact, it's probably not all factual or truthful. I think what you can find on this website will be. First thing to think about when we think about alternatives is many people are not interested in physically handling wildlife. They want to be hands-off, but they realize that there may be a role in reducing animal numbers, and we can reduce animal numbers by lethal techniques or by fertility control and contraception. Fertility control and contraception has been tried for many, many years in wildlife populations. Some are fairly effective. Some have some behavioral changes that are not acceptable. Some are expensive. All seem to be changing rapidly. But unfortunately, many of the fertility control and contraceptive agents are still experimental. We don't have federal registrations or state registration for very many fertility control agents, but there are some out there. Those that would first come to mind would be things for pigeons, Canada geese. There are also products out there nationwide, but not yet registered in Kansas for white-tailed deer. There are products that are registered to reduce wild horses and burros. Unfortunately, there's no good technique to deliver those products to only the target animal. So when there are other animals in the environment that may have access to that particular product, it really makes things complicated in trying to deliver that product only to the target species. Some of those behavior changes are not acceptable. They could include things of causing animals to be much more excitable. They could be in estrus for a longer period of time. Their home range might differ. So it's not a panacea yet. I suspect in 10 years, there will be a lot more work on fertility control and contraception, and many of those techniques will have registrations. As an example of fertility control, I want to remind you of a project that was done on Staten Island. Staten Island is a pretty isolated area. The deer herd in 2008 was 24 animals. There was no hunting. By 2017, the herd was over 2,000 animals. They contracted with a firm to vasectomize the male deer in that particular population. That initial cost was $4.1 million, and it reduced the herd by 316 animals. So taxpayers spend over $12,000 per head to reduce the herd 15%. Now, there are some communities that can use that type of approach, but there's not very many that I've come across here in Kansas. So if we're not able to prevent the animals from being born, can we just capture those animals and take them away and relocate them somewhere else? It's called wildlife translocation. In fact, there's a tremendous number of box traps or cage traps that are sold each year. I think that many times those animals are captured, simply taking down the road a ways and released, whether they had permission to release those animals or not. There's some problems with that, in that individual animals often try to return to the site of capture. And if you have a good habitat, other individuals are going to simply replace those that have been translocated. The translocated animals often create the same problems where they've been relocated. But I think perhaps most importantly, the fate of those translocated animals is not very good. A 2004 study looking at gray squirrels that were live trapped and relocated from suburban areas to a large forested area showed a 97% of those squirrels either soon died or disappeared from that release area. Now that's the most dramatic study that I could find, but keep in mind, capturing those animals, relocating them may not be as kind to those animals and may not ensure that they live happily ever after. So the consequences of translocation are usually severe. You've relocated an animal that knew where the food was, they knew where the cover was, they knew where the predators, which may be neighborhood dogs, and then they've been released in an area that may not be suitable habitat, and they don't know where those food resources are. That may not be important for some species, like a raccoon, that's pretty much of a generalist. But when you talk about a squirrel that is stored food and cached food, now you release them in perhaps in fall or midwinter, and they don't know where those food resources are. So you've just sentenced them to a long, slower death. The cost certainly varies depending upon the species and the scope of that particular translocation effort, but it is currently allowed in Kansas. You can translocate nuisance wildlife, but there is a restriction in that you must have permission, whether it's on private or public land, where you relocate the animal. So if you can't keep them from being born, you're not able to translocate them, what's the next option? That's lethal removal or euthanasia. Euthanasia means a good death, in a humane manner that minimizes stress and discomfort of the animal. Most of those times, the death should occur instantly or while the animal is unconscious. These are some options that have been recommended by the American Veterinary Medical Association as suitable for wildlife. Those two that are highlighted are two that are used most frequently. But I think most professionals that deal with nuisance animals and use euthanasia are going to use carbon dioxide as the technique. It's fairly inexpensive. Carbon dioxide is widely available at welding supply stores as a pressurized gas. You use a euthanasia chamber that can be something very sophisticated or as simple as a plastic trash can with a lid. And it's been proven to be a humane manner humane manner of death using carbon dioxide. In places where it's legal and allowed, gunshot, cervical dislocation are also techniques that I use on occasion. And then finally, sometimes I use lethal capture methods. So the animal is actually dead when the animal is taken out of the trap. So it's not something that you have to do personally. So those are some ways to euthanize animals. It's not for everyone. It's a very much an individual moral decision whether you want to take the life of that animal. But most of the time we're dealing with individuals that are quite numerous. They're already documented as having a problem, and it's your decision whether the problem is severe enough that it's going to require the removal of that particular animal. And then I ask people to think through these few questions. Can you euthanize that animal in a manner that's safe? Are there going to be any ecological consequences of euthanizing that individual animal, or let's say a colony of voles or a flock of birds? Can it be done in a practical and humane manner? Is it legal? And then finally, in this day and age with everyone having a cell phone camera, how is it going to play on the evening news? And euthanasia should not be done in the view of the public. And in spite of all of those potential problems, why do I recommend it? I recommend it because death works. It temporarily solves the problem and gives you time to implement the habitat modifications that can prevent the problem from reoccurring. When we talk about legal, Kansas law statutes, 321002 does not prevent landowners or legal occupants from killing animals when found in or near buildings or when destroying property, subject to some criteria. First, it cannot be a federally protected species. Federally protected species are most migratory birds and threatened and endangered species. It's unlawful to use or possess with the intent to use any of the animals that are killed under the authority of this statute, and that you landowners or legal occupants must have made reasonable efforts to alleviate the problems before killing them. There are some exemptions to this in that professionals or folks that have participated in the wildlife damage control examination and permit process then have authority to do this for you as a commercial business. So if you have a raccoon that's under your deck or a skunk that's under your deck, since both of those are regulated species, they're causing damage, that this particular statute says the owner or legal occupant. That doesn't mean your nephew or someone down the street that happens to have a cage trap. This says owner or legal occupant. If that's not going to be followed, then you're going to have to get a professional to deal with that. You can find a link to those folks that have the permits off of my website, or Wildlife and Parks, Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks maintains that database. They're the ones that actually issue that permit, and those are all found by searching through their website as well. So now let's get into some individual species that I get a lot of questions about. For all of them, we're going to be following the acronym HER. So is there a way to modify the habitat to reduce the number of deer? We first have to ask ourselves, what do deer eat? Perhaps the answer would be almost anything. Then next would be, what is deer cover? And we remove all of the deer cover from an area. Well, deer are very adaptable. They can live in dense woodlands and sparse prairies. So we're probably not going to be able to remove the cover. Do deer need water? Of course they need water, but they're pretty mobile, so they can go a fair distance to find that water. So it's going to be very difficult to eliminate all of those and make the habitat so sterile that deer are not going to find it useful. So that pushes us into exclusion. The first thing we think about is some sort of a physical barrier. Those physical barriers are things like chain link fence. But I often recommend the use of psychological barriers. The polynet electrified mesh fence works well. There are many different fence designs to reduce deer damage. Some are more aesthetically pleasing than others. Some are more expensive than others. They're not 100%. No management technique is 100% effective. Some work better than the others. But when putting up fence for deer, the things that make it a little bit more effective is to put it up early before the damage occurs. If you're using electrified fence, make sure that the fence stays energized throughout the growing season or the length of time you want to protect the crop. And make sure that the fence wires, whether it's this plastic mesh with the aluminum strands woven through it so it conducts electricity, or some other material, make sure that it's very visible to the deer. It can't be hidden in tall grass and weeds because the deer are already into the fence material before they see it. I encourage people to pre-bait the fence with peanut butter or peanut oil or some other flavor that deer find attractive so that they initially receive a shock. remember, this is not a physical barrier. This is a psychological barrier. And anything you can do to help train the deer that they're going to receive something unpleasant when they come up against that fence is going to help. They need to be powered with a pretty good energizer. There's lots of different ways to measure the quality of energizers, whether you're looking at volts or joules or miles of fence that they will power, or the cost of those energizers. I like to see at least a 3,000 or 4,000 volt energizer to be used, or something that's probably going to cost at least $100. There are some fence energizers that are available and work off of a couple of D-cell batteries that have an output, but those are not going to be strong enough to repel many species of wildlife. There is some science behind which fences seem to be more effective. There is certainly rankings and that are based on cost and efficacy and longevity and the amount of maintenance. So as you might expect, those fences that cost the most and last the longest seem to have the highest efficacy. But all will reduce damage, but there are probably very few fences that are completely deer-proof. Another exclusion technique is tree shelters when we're discussing trees. Male deer rub their antlers on these trees. This just puts a physical barrier around that tree to prevent deer from rubbing antlers on it. Repellents really rely on different mechanisms to be effective. Usually it's fear or conditions avoidance by changing, or it can be used as a technique to induce pain or change the taste or palatability of the plant. There are not many repellents that are labeled for human consumed crops. So be careful, make sure you follow the label when you're using a repellent, which is a technique to exclude the animal from the area. Repellents and their avoidance is affected by lots of different criteria, including the number and the density of the animals that are causing the problems, those animals' mobility, the prior experience that those animals have with repellents, the palatability of those crops, weather conditions, but I think most importantly, it's affected by the availability of alternative food. If you have the only food supply, it may be very difficult to keep deer out of a garden. If there's other gardens nearby, you may not have to have a very effective repellent in order to achieve satisfactory results. Another thing that could be done on habitat modification is the introduction of additional predators. We're probably not going to allow large predators like lions and tigers and bears, but domestic dogs do a good job of chasing deer, but they need to be confined and learn where the property boundaries are. This particular study done in Missouri showed that 4 dogs that were trained at the perimeter with the invisible fences or the pet fencing could reduce deer damage over 90% in that nursery where they were utilized. And finally, select things that are not particularly palatable to deer. It could be perennials. Here's some options. Rutgers has a particularly, what I think is a good website that's searchable by plant name, scientific name, or common name, and the ability of those plants to be deer resistant. Let's jump on into rodents, because that would be the second species that the species that ranks number 2 in the number of complaints I get. Primarily it's prairie voles, can be cotton rats, kangaroo rats, and 13-line ground squirrels. All I see and hear about problems with those small rodents in gardens. Prairie voles are very prolific. They can have a litter almost every month. The population can build up so that you have a colony that may be 300 to 500 individuals per acre in unmanaged, ungrazed, unmowed prairie situations. So they like thick leaf litter, thick ground cover. So if we're following the acronym HER, habitat modification would be mow it very short for prairie voles, reduce their hiding places. That may be under mulches that you may have applied. It may be over landscape fabric that you put down as a mulch. Those are ideal overhead cover for voles. So mow it short, remove that cover, have less problems with voles. But again, knowing the biological requirements of a species like the 13-line ground squirrel, you would not use the same type technique. 13-line ground squirrels avoid predators by visually seeing the predators and having escape holes nearby. They require short vegetation. So if I had a problem with 13-line ground squirrels and I wanted to use habitat modification to reduce those problems, I would let the grass get taller, 5 to 6 inches in height. You're probably not going to have suitable habitat for 13-line ground squirrels. Other techniques that may be utilized would be in the lethal area. We would use toxicants or snap trapping. But snap trapping with the plastic or wooden-based mouse or rat traps is not something that's acceptable to everyone. There are also concerns with the use of toxicants. So it's not a panacea, but it is a group of techniques that's acceptable. It's widely used, but there are some hazards with it. If you're going to use toxicants, remember they're formulated to do one thing, and that's to kill the object that's eating them. And they do a good job at that. So you want to make sure that the access to those products is only available to those target species, and that pets and children do not have access if you're using toxicants in the environment. Armadillos may be another problem for some people. A few questions come up each week about armadillos. They're slowly moving north. They're already north of Omaha, Nebraska. They arrived in Kansas in late 1940s. Seem to be getting higher densities each and every year, quite commonly found north of I-70. So there's some factors out there have yet to be determined why they're able to continue to move northward, but they can be very devastating in a yard or garden, not because they're going to be eating plants, but because of their digging and disruption of plants that are already in the ground and being managed. There's not much you're going to be able to do habitat management wise for armadillos, since they're eating insects and invertebrates. Same thing when we're looking about cover. They can persist in tall grass, short grass, woodlands, shrubby type environments. So most of the time you're going to be removing armadillos, either relocating them or euthanizing them. And science has shown that a wooden pre-scented with armadillo box trap is 8 times more effective than wire cages for capturing armadillos. Eastern cottontails, probably one of the more common problems, but I think many people just learn to accept it. If we follow the HER again, what do eastern cottontails eat? Almost any forb in the spring, summer, and early fall. When those succulent forbs senesce in the late fall and early winter, they go on to woody materials, where they're often just eating the bark and girdling some of the plants, which is going to result in the death of that particular plant. So it's very difficult to remove all of those things from the environment. But what you can do is make it more open. Eastern cottontails like dense ground cover. So if you can increase the fear factor by opening that area up, allow predators to have access to those cottontails, they cease to find it as quite as good a shelter, and the density is reduced. You're probably not going to remove all of the food, but you can do something to reduce the suitability of the cover for eastern cottontails. Those are not effective, then you need to go to exclusion. That may be small wires or wire mesh around individual plants or around individual gardens. Once again, that plastic netting that is energized is a great tool for keeping eastern cottontails out of gardens. You're going to capture eastern cottontails. The wooden box traps seem to be much more efficient because the rabbit thinks they're going into a burrow, and they go into those traps much more readily than they do into a wire cage that's setting out into the open. Just one of the techniques that you can utilize to relocate or capture and then euthanize eastern cottontails. There are some rabbit repellents that seem to be more effective than those repellents that are utilized for deer. Those repellents can be chemicals or they can be predators, whether they're domestic pets or whether you're trying to open that area up and let other predators like hawks, owls, or fox in the area that may be able to reduce the density of cottontails. Science has shown that plant skid ranked very high as a repellent of reducing rabbits feeding on plants in a confined scientific experiment. So if I had to recommend a repellent for rabbits, plant skid would be one of those products. But there are many others out there. Anecdotal information shows some people get along great with those repellents. Others do not have very good success. But again, check to make sure that that particular product is labeled for human food plants if that's what you're applying it on. Or just like you're doing for deer, plant something that rabbits don't prefer. Here's a list of things that rabbits seem to prefer, but plants with strong aromas or dense hair on the stem are typically avoided by rabbits. Again, there are several lists out there of plants that are preferred by rabbits. Some others do the reverse, where they provide a list of plants that seem to be rabbit resistant. Tree squirrels, either gray squirrels or fox squirrels, are a problem for many people in gardens, whether they're foraging on the stem of the plant as it first comes up, or waiting like many squirrels do and take 1 or 2 bites out of each tomato as it ripens. Habitat management wise, what can we do for squirrels? The first thing would be try to reduce their access to food. If you're feeding birds and have an abundance of bird seed that's spilled on the ground, try to clean that up, reduce the food, open the area up where predators have more access to squirrels. That may be thinning some of the vines, removing some of the taller trees, or opening it up at ground level so that predators would have access to squirrels that are moving from tree to tree. Exclusion is fairly difficult for squirrels, particularly if you're in an area that has a lot of trees whose canopies overlap, because then you have to use a technique around all of the trees, or the squirrels are able to just run through the trees at the top or through wires where there's cable or electric transmission lines that run through the tops of those trees. But on individual trees that are somewhat isolated, you can put up a squirrel guard to keep squirrels out of those trees, and perhaps save fruit like pears, cherries, pecans. Those are some exclusion techniques that work well for squirrels. I also, again, like the poly net or poly mesh fence that's electrified. It works good around gardens. A few squirrels may learn to jump over it, but most do not. And once they receive a couple of shocks, then learn to stay away from that particular area. Some people have success just using 1 or 2 wires to repel squirrels, but I think the poly mesh does a better job of being more of a broadly focused repellent approach and at excluding many more species of wildlife than just 1 or 2 wires that are an inch or 2 off of the ground. Raccoons, certainly very problematic in most gardens, but they're very destructive. In my opinion, raccoons may cause more damage in suburban, urban environments than any of the other species, but it's most apparent in sweet corn. They can feed right off of the stalk by shredding the husk, or they simply wallow around and break the corn stalk down and then feed on it when it's on the ground, but can be very damaging in gardens. But again, following the acronym HER, can we remove everything that raccoons find for food value? And the answer is probably no. They're truly a generalist. They get by in a wide variety of environments. They're very adaptable. They're very smart. They're difficult to exclude because of their body strength. They can chew their way in through roofs or into buildings. So I suggest fencing, electrified fencing works great for raccoons and is, again, is very commonly used for other species, and you're going to get lots of benefits at repelling other species with the electrified fencing. Or removal. I'm not a fan of relocating species like raccoons that are definitely linked to some diseases, but that is an option and is legal technique here in Kansas. I think we'll just finish up here with the eastern woodchuck. I would assume our listeners are from all across the state, but in the eastern half or eastern third of the state, woodchucks can be a significant pest in gardens. They're one of our true hibernators, so they're not going to be a problem in the winter. But when we think about what we can do habitat-wise for eastern woodchucks, it's very difficult to make an area so sterile that woodchucks are not going to find anything of value there. They feed on succulent vegetation, on garden plants, on grasses, legumes. So they're often the best approach is to exclude them from the area or remove them from an area. But seems to be a fairly common species of problem in the eastern third of Kansas. I think my time is just about up for the 45 minutes. So kind of in summary, when we talk about solving problems, we want to try education. Can you build up tolerance to people to accept minor amounts of damage through education? Can we use some sort of cultural techniques to alter the situation where people don't find it as problematic, or exclude the animal with the use of fencing, netting, or repellents? Or can you scare the animal away with visual or acoustic devices? And finally, and when those don't work, you may have to remove the animal either alive or relocate that animal. But I would encourage you to always follow that acronym, HER. And when that fails, you can always call me. With that, the panelists have some questions for me.
Thank you, Charlie, for sharing your knowledge today. That was very informative. We have a lot of questions we need to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to Cassie, and she can start asking you the questions.
Okay, thank you so much. That was an awesome presentation. Our first question, someone wants to know if you have an opinion on the recent EPA approval of cyanide bombs.
The recent EPA approval of cyanide bombs?
Yes.
Cyanide has been used since in some states for at least since 1972 after it was outlawed. It is not legal in Kansas. So it has been used, I think it's used in 18 states. Some of those states do not allow it used by private individuals. It's only being able to be used by government employees. So I do not see that as a concern for Kansans since it's not legal or registered up here in the state at this time.
Okay. Someone wants to know if there's any distance guidelines that ground squirrels need to be taken so they don't return to the same yard.
Well, there's distances or home ranges that they would normally be found in, and distances or individual animals that may be marathon runners and be able to make it back. But most ground squirrels would not have to be taken more than a half mile or away in order to prevent them from returning, probably because they're going to be picked off by a predator before they find their way back. So I can't give you a set distance, but I would, as a informed guess, I would say more than a mile would be probably excessive.
Okay, thank you. So this question might be not about gardening as much, but someone wants to know if you have any solutions for feral cats and around the yard.
Yes, promote the idea that cats are indoor pets and not allow them to roam free when they're truly feral. I'm not a fan of trap, neuter, and release programs. I'm not a fan of people feeding cats because of the problems that they cause when they turn feral, and all of the birds and other smaller species, including rodents and reptiles and amphibians that they capture or thrill kill. So they can be captured in cage traps until they've been captured and relocated a couple of times, and then they become very difficult to go back into a cage. There are some repellents. I don't find them particularly real effective on cats or dogs, but there are some registered and some people have success with them. The motion activated lawn sprinklers do a pretty good job of keeping cats out of select areas of a yard. So I guess that's about the best I can come up with for feral cats that quickly.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about systemic animal repellents. Do you know if K-State has done any type of research on those repellents, specifically Repellix systematic granular chemical?
The question is, have we done any research on repellents that are systemic, meaning accepted and go into the plant where they can be change the taste or change the smell or palatability of the plant? I've not done specific research on repellents. I've done demonstrations where we've used repellents in side-by-side tests. The efficacy of those repellents, regardless of which one was used, was not very good. But as far as doing research on them, no. I've not done research on repellents, nor know anyone else at Kansas State that's doing research on repellents for wildlife.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about how effective is spray repellent for squirrels and chipmunks?
My answer would be, like it is for most repellents, is it's not very efficacious. If I had to put a percentage to it, I would say less than 50% of the time do I find repellents show any efficacy at all. It's very rare that I've seen a repellent provide 100% efficacy for a very long period of time. So I'm not a big fan of repellents, primarily because I get asked for solutions to problems, not just things that they can continue to buy and try. There are some repellents that seem to work better than others, so they're not all created equal. Depending on which species of wildlife that you're talking about. Deer are very difficult to deter, and most of the repellents there that seem to work better than the others are those that have a strong sulfur smell. For rabbits, the plant skid, which is dehydrated pork blood, a very earthy smell, not objectionable. Seems to be the repellent that works best on rabbits. I don't even know if it's labeled for squirrels. It may be for squirrels, but typically I would not find a repellent to be very useful for squirrels.
All right, thank you. Someone is curious about squirrels' nests. Do they return to old nests or make new nests each year?
Squirrels will often return to nest and revitalize or redo those nests, but sometimes the juvenile squirrels from previous litters are making own nests as they become reproductively active. So you could get old nests being reused and new nests built in the same general area.
Okay, someone is wanting to know about hispid cotton rats in the veggie garden, what to do about them.
Hispid cotton rats is more of an agricultural rat. They do well in open areas, but their populations can increase very quickly. Typically, if you're not going to use one of the small mesh electrified fences, they're very good at climbing. They can also dig, so it's difficult to exclude them from an area, but you can keep it mowed very short where they're more likely to be picked off by the existing predator populations, or you can use the snap traps, or you can use toxicants that are labeled for cotton rats. If you use toxicants, I would suggest that they be put out in bait stations so that they're not accessible to pets or kids or non-target wildlife species.
Okay, someone is dealing with chipmunks and they would like to know the best removal for chipmunks.
Probably the cage trap is a technique that is very effective, or the wooden-based snap traps or eastern chipmunks, or habitat modification can be utilized by filling the burrows. Most of the problem with chipmunks that I get questions about is they're burrowing and digging and causing walls and foundations and sidewalks and things to collapse. Those can be filled with pea gravel, packed into existing burrows, which they have a very difficult time then opening back up. You just make the area unsuitable. I don't find anything particularly very effective at repelling squirrels other than the electrified fence netting. And I do not think there are any toxicants that are labeled for chipmunks here in Kansas. So trapping or habitat modification would be the two things that I would try for eastern chipmunks.
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Someone is wanting you to address how to deal with coyotes in town.
Well, coyotes are not that much different than all of the rest. Think about the acronym HER. What type of environment are they found in? What do they use for cover? We're probably not going to exclude those. They are almost as a bigger generalist than raccoons, so they eat a wide variety of things. So you're probably not going to be able to modify the habitat so that they stay away. Exclusion is a good technique if you're worried about protecting your garden or your pets. Just make sure that you have a coyote-proof fence. They can dig, but they're pretty lazy, but they prefer to crawl under a fence than jump over it, but they can get over a 6-foot-high fence by kind of climbing up on it. The solution is to make sure that coyotes remember that they're wildlife and not treat them as pets. Oftentimes when coyotes are in cities or suburban areas and they become a problem is because someone in the neighborhood has thought they looked particularly cute and start feeding them, and then eventually they lose their fear of people. So I encourage people to try to keep coyotes wild, make noise, run at them, throw rocks at them, spray them with water, whatever you can do to make sure that coyotes remember they're not at the top of the food chain and that they should fear people is something that's good to try. When those techniques are not effective, then you're probably going to have to remove animals, remove individual coyotes through trapping or snaring.
Okay, thank you. How effective is a homemade garlic spray to deter deer and rabbits?
Well, that was a very difficult one to answer because I don't know their homemade recipe. Other garlic repellents that are on the market commercially don't seem to rank very high, but in advertising materials or testimonials that I see in the back of garden magazines, or some people say they worked well for a short period of time. Personally, that would not be a product that I would try.
All right, we probably have time for one or two more. Someone has a horrible problem with moles in their landscape. Any advice on how to get rid of them?
Moles with a M or V?
Yes.
Moles with an M. They're an insectivore. Feed primarily on earthworms, so you're not going to be able to remove all of their food supply. They live in the soil, so you're not going to be able to remove the soil. The only habitat modification I know that works for moles is keep the ground very wet. They don't like to have their fur wet, but that type of moisture, soil moisture is almost too extensive to get anything else to grow. So it almost turns it into a pond. So habitat modification doesn't work for moles. You can exclude them with fencing if you bury it deep enough. They're not very good at climbing. But most of the time I tell people, if you have a problem with moles, you either learn to trap them or you learn to live with them, because all of the other information that's out there on repellents and techniques that may work simply have not been proven so with science.
All right, well, it's almost 1 o'clock, so I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap up the Q&A.
All right, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Once again, thank you everybody for joining the K-State Garden Hours series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We're so glad that you could be here with us today to learn about nuisance wildlife control in your gardens. We have had several awesome webinar series coming up. Be sure to visit our H&R website page to see all the upcoming topics. Next week's webinar is hydrangeas for the garden. Be sure to join us for that. Today's session was recorded and will be up and posted on our H&R website by tomorrow afternoon. You will receive an email with an evaluation survey. Please fill this out as we graciously appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at ksuemg@ksu.edu. And thank you again for joining us and have a great week.